There is a quiet truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Your future is not something waiting for you in the distance. It is not hidden in tomorrow. It is not controlled by fate, luck, or destiny. Your future is being constructed right now. In the smallest choices, in the silent decisions, in the moments no one else sees, you believe your life will change one day. But that one day is nothing more than a collection of today's repeated actions. And this is where the unconscious begins its work. Because what you do daily, you no longer question. What you repeat becomes who you are. And what you ignore slowly shapes your destiny from the shadows. Most people are not building their future consciously. They are drifting into it unconsciously. They delay. They distract themselves. They escape into comfort. And then one day they wake up, not to the life they dreamed of, but to the life they quietly constructed through neglect. You must understand this. Every day is not just a day. It is a psychological brick, a fragment of your becoming. Most people imagine that the unconscious mind is some mysterious, distant force, something hidden deep within them that often innately influences their behavior. But the truth is far more unsettling and far more powerful. Your unconscious is not something you were simply born with, fixed and unchanging. It is something you are actively shaping every single day through repetition, not through what you think, not through what you plan, but through what you do. Again and again. Every repeated action is like a quiet command given to your inner world, and the unconscious listens without judgment, without resistance, without questioning whether what you are teaching it is good or destructive. If you wake up each day and reach for distraction, your unconscious does not argue. It does not say, "This is wasting your potential." Instead, it adapts, it learns. It accepts this behavior as truth. It begins to build an identity around it. This is who we are. This is what we do. And that is how a life is quietly formed, not through dramatic decisions, but through unconscious conditioning. Repetition is the language of the psyche. What you repeat, you reinforce. What you reinforce, you become. This is why a single act of discipline feels insignificant, but repeated daily, it becomes identity. And identity, once formed, begins to control behavior automatically. At that point you are no longer choosing. You are simply expressing what has already been programmed within you. This is the paradox. People believe they are making choices, while in reality, their past repetitions are making choices for them. A man who has repeated avoidance does not wake up and consciously decide to procrastinate. He simply feels resistance and follows it. To him, it feels natural, effortless, almost inevitable. But what he calls natural is nothing more than conditioned repetition solidified into identity. The same is true for strength. A person who is trained discipline daily does not fight themselves each morning. They do not negotiate with discomfort. They act. Not because it is easy, but because it has become familiar. Repetition transforms struggle into instinct. And this is where most people fail to understand the true danger of their daily habits. Because the unconscious does not record intensity, it records frequency. It does not matter how motivated you feel once a week. It does not matter how inspired you are in rare moments. What matters is what you do consistently. A small act, repeated daily, carries more psychological weight than a massive effort done once and abandoned. This is how identities are truly formed, not in moments of passion, but in patterns of behavior. And once a pattern is repeated enough times, it no longer feels like a pattern. It feels like you. That is the moment when change becomes difficult. Because now, you are not just trying to change your actions, you are trying to confront a version of yourself that has been built over time, and the unconscious resists disruption. It seeks familiarity, even if that familiarity is limiting, even if it is destructive. This is why people remain stuck, not because they lack desire, not because they lack intelligence, but because their unconscious has been trained through repetition to prefer comfort over growth, avoidance over responsibility, distraction over focus. And so, when they attempt to change, they feel an internal friction, a quiet resistance, a voice that says, "This is not who we are." But that voice is not truth, it is memory. It is the echo of everything you have repeatedly done up until now. The powerful realization is this: if repetition created your current self, and repetition can also recreate you. You do not need a sudden transformation. You do not need perfect motivation. You need consistent, conscious repetition, to act differently even when it feels unnatural, to choose discipline even when resistance appears, to repeat behaviors that align with the person you intend to become. At first, it will feel forced, artificial, and uncomfortable, because you are going against the momentum of your past. But if you persist, something begins to shift, the resistance weakens, the action becomes easy. The unfamiliar becomes familiar, and slowly, almost invisibly, a new identity begins to form beneath the surface. Until one day, you realize, you are no longer forcing yourself, you are no longer fighting yourself. You have become someone else, not through one decision, but through repetition. This is the hidden mechanism behind all transformation. You are not defined by what you want to be. You are defined by what you repeatedly do. So if you truly want to change your future, do not focus on grand visions. Focus on what you are reinforcing today, because your unconscious is always watching, always learning, always becoming. 3. And whether you realize it or not, it is building you. Most people are blind to the true power of small actions because they measure life in dramatic moments. They wait for breakthroughs, life-changing decisions, rare opportunities, believing that transformation arrives in a single, explosive event. But the psyche does not operate through sudden revolutions. It reshapes itself through quiet, repeated signals. A small action seems insignificant only because it is easy to overlook. It does not shake the world. It does not demand attention. It feels too minor to matter. But to your inner world it carries a message, a subtle instruction that says, "This is who I am." And the unconscious listens very carefully to these messages. When you choose to get up the moment your alarm rings instead of delaying, you are not just waking up, you are sending a signal of order over chaos. When you decide to complete a task instead of abandoning it midway, you are not just finishing work, you are reinforcing reliability within yourself. When you resist distraction for even a short period, you are not just focusing, you are teaching your mind that it is capable of control. Each action, no matter how small, leaves a psychological imprint. These imprints accumulate, and accumulation is where the real transformation begins. Because the unconscious mind does not evaluate the size of an action, it evaluates the consistency of it. A single act of discipline may feel powerful, but it fades quickly. A small act, repeated daily, begins to carve pathways in your mind. It creates familiarity, and familiarity over time becomes identity. This is why someone who studies for just 20 minutes every day will eventually outperform someone who studies intensely but inconsistently. It is not about effort alone, it is about the pattern being installed within the psyche. Small actions are like drops of water falling on stone. Individually they appear weak, but over time they shape the stone itself. And the stone, in this case, is you. The tragedy is that most people underestimate these moments. They treat them casually. They think this one choice doesn't matter. But that is precisely where the danger lies. Because every time you ignore a small positive action, you are not staying neutral, you are reinforcing the opposite. Every time you choose comfort over effort, even in the same situation, you are strengthening a pattern of avoidance. Every time you delay something simple, you are teaching your mind that delay is acceptable. These micro-decisions do not disappear. They accumulate silently, building a version of you that feels increasingly difficult to escape. And one day, you look at your life and wonder how you arrived here without realizing that it was built through thousands of seemingly insignificant choices. But the same principle that creates weakness can create strength. For a single day of discipline may not transform you, but a single disciplined action repeated daily will. When you choose to do something small but meaningful, reading a few pages, exercising briefly, focusing for a short period, you are not just completing a task, you are placing a psychological brick. And each brick contributes to a structure that did not exist before. At first, the structure is invisible. There is no immediate reward, no visible change. And this is where most people give up, because they expect to feel different quickly. But the unconscious works in silence. It builds beneath awareness, layer by layer, until the change becomes undeniable. Here comes a moment when the effort that once felt heavy begins to feel natural. What once required willpower begins to require less resistance. And eventually what was once difficult becomes automatic. This is the hidden reward of small actions. They remove the need for constant struggle. They transform effort into instinct. And when something becomes instinct, it no longer drains you, it expresses you. But there is another layer to understand, perhaps the most important one. Small actions do not just build habits, they shape your sense of self. Every time you follow through on a small commitment, you build trust within yourself. You begin to see yourself as someone who acts, someone who completes, someone who moves forward. This internal trust is far more powerful than motivation because it stabilizes your identity, and identity is the foundation of all behavior. If you see yourself as disciplined, you will act accordingly. If you see yourself as inconsistent, you will repeat that pattern. And your identity is not formed through words or affirmations. It is formed through evidence, through the actions you repeatedly take. This is why small actions carry immense psychological and calorie weight, because they provide constant evidence of who you are becoming. Not in theory, but in reality. So when you stand at a small decision whether to act or delay, to focus or distract yourself, to move forward or stay still, understand that you are not facing a minor choice. You are shaping your mind. You are reinforcing a pattern. You are building an identity. And that identity, once formed, will shape your entire future. The power of transformation is not hidden in grand gestures. It is hidden in the discipline of small, consistent action, because in the end, your life is not the result of what you did occasionally. It is the result of what you did repeatedly, in moments that felt too small to matter, and that is precisely why they matter the most. There is a dangerous illusion that lives quietly in the human mind, the belief that doing nothing is neutral, that when you delay, when you avoid, when you step back from what must be done, you are simply pausing, waiting, preserving energy for a better moment. But there is no neutrality in the psyche. 5. Every moment is a movement. Every inaction is a direction. Every avoidance is a decision. When you turn away from something difficult, you are not escaping the consequence of that moment, you are shaping it. You are choosing a path just as clearly as if you had acted with intention. The difference is that this choice is often unconscious, disguised as hesitation, comfort, or even self-protection. And this is where it becomes dangerous, because what you call waiting is often fear. What you call rest is often resistance. What you call later is often silent surrender. The unconscious mind does not interpret your reasons. It does not analyze your justifications. It only records your behavior. And when it sees repeated avoidance, it learns something very specific. This is how we respond to challenge. This is who we are under pressure. That learning does not stay in one area of your life. It spreads. Avoid one responsibility, and the mind becomes slightly more comfortable avoiding the next. Delay one difficult conversation, and it becomes easier to delay another. Ignore one opportunity, and the pattern of hesitation begins to take root. Over time, avoidance stops being a choice. It becomes a reflex, and once it becomes a reflex, it begins to define you. You may tell you are capable, that you have potential, that you will act when the time is right. But your unconscious does not operate on potential. It operates on proof. And every avoided moment becomes proof of limitation. This is why people often feel trapped in lives they never consciously chose. Not because they made one catastrophic decision, but because they made thousands of small avoidant ones. They stepped back instead of forward. They chose comfort instead of growth. They delayed instead of confronting. And slowly, silently, a life was constructed not through bold intention but through quiet withdrawal. Avoidance is not passive. It is creative. It creates a version of you that becomes increasingly disconnected from your own strength. Each time you avoid, you weaken the bridge between who you are and who you could become. You reinforce the idea that difficulty is something to escape rather than something to face. And the more this idea is reinforced, the more real it feels. Eventually you begin to believe that you cannot act, when in reality, you have simply trained yourself not to. This is the hidden cost of avoidance. It reshapes your perception of yourself. Tasks that were once manageable begin to feel overwhelming. Decisions that were once simple begin to feel heavy. Actions that were once possible begin to feel out of reach. Not because reality has changed, but because your repeated avoidance has altered your inner landscape. And yet, the mind is not beyond reconstruction. The same mechanism that builds weakness can build strength, but it begins with a brutal realization. You must stop lying to yourself about inaction. 6. You must see avoidance for what it truly is, not a pause, not a delay, not a harmless moment, but a decision that carries consequences. A decision to stay where you are. A decision to reinforce fear. A decision to step away from your own potential. And once you see it clearly, something shifts. Because now, every moment of hesitation becomes visible. Every internal excuse reveals itself. Every urge to delay is exposed as a crossroads rather than a comfort. And in that awareness you regain power. You begin to understand that action is not always about intensity or perfection. It is about direction. Even the smallest step forward breaks the pattern. Even the smallest act of courage disrupts the cycle of avoidance. It does not need to be dramatic. It needs to be deliberate. When you act in the presence of resistance, even in a minor way, you send a new signal to your unconscious. We do not retreat. We do not escape. We move. And at first, this will feel unnatural. There will be friction. There will be discomfort. The pull of old patterns will remain strong because they have been reinforced over time. But if you repeatedly choose action over avoidance, the pattern begins to weaken. The reflex begins to change. And slowly the identity begins to shift. You no longer see yourself as someone who hesitates. You begin to see yourself as someone who confronts. And that shift changes everything. Because once you stop avoiding, life itself begins to open. Opportunities that once felt intimidating become accessible. Challenges that once felt overwhelming become manageable. The energy that was once spent on escape becomes available for growth. You realize that the barrier was never the task, the situation, or the world outside. It was the pattern within. So the next time you feel the urge to delay, to step back, to choose comfort over confrontation, do not dismiss it as a small moment. Recognize it for what it is, a decision point, a silent vote for the person you are becoming. Because in the end, your life is not shaped only by what you choose to face. It is equally shaped by what you choose to avoid. And whether you build strength or weakness depends on which direction you decide to move in moments that feel small, but are never insignificant. There is a part of you that you do not fully see, yet it watches every decision you make. It does not speak loudly. It does not demand attention. It waits quietly, patiently in the background of your life. This is the shadow. Not evil in itself, not something to be feared in the simplistic sense, but something far more subtle and dangerous. The unacknowledged part of your psyche that grows stronger the more you ignore it. Most people imagine that their greatest threat is failure or hardship or the external world. But the real danger is internal and far quieter. It is the slow strengthening of tendencies you refuse to confront. It is the accumulation of 7 ignored impulses, avoided responsibilities, and denied truths. The shadow does not grow in dramatic mom-and-tars. It grows in neglect. Every time you know what must be done but choose not to act, something shifts within you. Not visibly, not immediately, but psychologically. A small gap forms between your awareness and your behavior. And in that gap the shadow begins to take root. It whispers in subtle ways. Not today. It doesn't matter. You can delay this. You deserve comfort. And because these whispers feel reasonable, even comforting, they are rarely challenged. They are accepted, absorbed, repeated. This is how the shadow gains power, not through force, but through agreement. The more you listen without resistance, the more it becomes familiar. And what is familiar begins to feel safe, even when it is limiting you. Daily neglect feeds this process. Neglect of your goals, neglect of your discipline, neglect of your inner truth. Each moment of neglect is like giving energy to something that thrives in darkness. And the more it is fed, the more it expands, shaping your reactions, your decisions, your sense of what is possible. At first, its influence is subtle. You delay a task, you avoid a challenge, you choose comfort over effort. These seem like small compromises. I am less in isolation. But the shadow does not operate in isolation. It accumulates. And as it accumulates, it begins to organize your behavior. It builds patterns. It creates tendencies. It slowly restructures your inner world until what was once a choice becomes an automatic response. You begin to notice that you hesitate more easily, that you doubt yourself more quickly, that you avoid discomfort almost instinctively, and you may not understand why. But the answer lies in what you have repeatedly neglected. Because every time you refuse to act, you strengthen the part of you that prefers inaction. Every time you ignored your responsibility, you reinforced the part of you that escapes it. Every time you turned away from growth, you empowered the part of you that resists it. The shadow grows not because it is inherently strong, but because it is consistently fed. And what makes this even more dangerous is that the shadow often disguises itself as your voice. It does not feel foreign. It feels like you. It says, "I'm just tired. I'll do it later. I'm not ready yet." And because it feels personal, it goes unquestioned. But this is the illusion. The shadow is not you. Truth. It is your unchallenged pattern. It is the result of repeated surrender. And if left unchecked, it begins to dominate not by taking control suddenly, but by gradually reducing your willingness to resist it. This is why people often feel trapped in cycles they cannot break. not because they lack strength, but because their shadow has been reinforced for so long that it feels like their natural state. 8. But there is a way to confront it, and it begins not with destruction but with awareness. You must begin to notice the moments where neglect occurs, the small decisions, the quiet hesitations, the subtle agreements you make with yourself to avoid delay or withdraw. These are not insignificant. They are the exact points where the shadow either grows or weakens, because the shadow cannot survive conscious resistance. The moment you see it clearly, when you recognize the voice, the pattern, the impulse, you create distance from it, and in that distance, you regain the ability to choose, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but consciously. Each time you act despite the pull of neglect, you interrupt the pattern. You deny the shadow the reinforcement it can depends on, and slowly its influence begins to diminish. Not because it disappears completely, but because it is no longer being fed. At the same time, something else begins to grow, a sense of control, a sense of clarity, a sense of alignment between what you know and what you do. This is the process of integration, not eliminating the shadow, but refusing to let it dominate through neglect. You begin to understand that the goal is not to become perfect, but to become aware, to stop living on autopilot, to stop allowing the unnoticed parts of your psyche to dictate your life. Because your future is not only shaped by what you actively build, it is equally shaped by what you allow to grow in the background. So the question is not whether the shadow exists, it always will. The real question is, are you feeding it or confronting it? Because in the quiet, unnoticed moments of daily life, something within you is always expanding, and whether it becomes your strength or your limitation depends entirely on what you choose to neglect. Most people move through life as if they are awake, but in truth, they are governed by patterns they do not see. They react instead of choosing. They repeat instead of creating. Their days unfold not through intention but through habit, automatic, familiar, and largely unconscious. And yet, they wonder why their future feels out of their control. The reality is this: a powerful future cannot be built on unconscious living, because when you are not aware, you are not deciding. And when you are not deciding, something else is deciding for you: your past, your conditioning, your fears, your habits. This is the quiet tragedy of the human mind. It prefers what is familiar over what is meaningful. It seeks comfort over growth. And unless you bring awareness into your actions, you will continue to recreate the same patterns, the same limitations, the same outcomes, no matter how much you desire change. To live consciously is not simply to think, it is to observe yourself in real time, to notice your impulses before you act on them, to recognize your patterns as they arise, to question whether your current behavior aligns with the future you claim to want. 9. This level of awareness is rare because it requires effort. It requires you to step out of autopilot, to interrupt the flow of unconscious repetition, and to take a responsibility for each moment as it unfolds. But without this awareness, transformation is impossible, because you cannot change what you do not see. When you begin to live consciously, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. You start to notice the small decisions that once passed unnoticed, the moments where you reach for distraction, where you delay action, where you choose comfort instead of discipline. And in seeing these moments, you create a space between impulse and action. And within that space lies your power. Before, the impulse would lead directly to behavior. There was no interruption, no reflection, only reaction. But now, with awareness, you are no longer immediately controlled by what you feel. You can pause, you can question, you can choose. And that choice, repeated over time, begins to reshape your entire life. Conscious living is not about perfection. It is not about always making the right decision or eliminating every flaw within you. It is about refusing to live blindly. It is about refusing to let your future be dictated by patterns you have never examined. It is about becoming an active participant in your own existence. This requires honesty, often uncomfortable honesty. You must be willing to see where you are inconsistent, where you are avoiding responsibility, where you are betraying your own intentions. Not to judge yourself, but to understand yourself, because understanding is the foundation of control. Without it, you are at the mercy of forces within you that operate without your consent. With it, you begin to take back authorship over your actions, your habits, your direction. And as this awareness deepens, something else begins to happen. Your values become clearer. You no longer act based on immediate emotion or external pressure. You begin to act based on what truly matters to you. Your decisions gain weight, your actions gain direction, your life gains coherence. You stop drifting, you start building. This is what separates those who create powerful futures from those who remain stuck in repetition. It is not intelligence, it is not luck. It is the willingness to remain conscious when it is easier to fall asleep into habit. Because unconscious living is effortless, it requires no reflection, no resistance, no responsibility. You simply follow what you feel, what you have always done, what is easiest in the moment, but that ease comes at a cost. It leads to a life that feels accidental, a future that feels disconnected from your desires, a sense that time is passing but nothing is truly changing. Conscious living, on the other hand, demands effort. It asks you to stay present when your mind wants to escape, to act with intention when your instincts pull you toward comfort, to remain aware even in moments of stress, boredom, or fatigue. 10. It is not easy, but it is the only path that leads to real power. Because power is not the ability to control the world around you, it is the ability to control yourself within it, to choose your actions deliberately, to align your behavior with your goals, to shape your identity through conscious repetition rather than unconscious drift. And over time this control compounds. Small conscious decisions become consistent patterns, patterns become habits, habits become identity, and identity shapes destiny. You begin to notice that your life is no longer random. Your progress is no longer inconsistent. Your direction is no longer unclear. You are building deliberately, steadily, consciously. And that is the true meaning of a powerful future. Not one that appears suddenly, not one that is given to you, but one that is constructed through awareness in each passing moment. So the question is not whether you are living, the question is whether you are living consciously. Because your future is being written right now in the decisions you notice, in the impulses you question, in the actions you choose, and whether that future becomes powerful or predictable depends entirely on how awake you are willing to be. Your future is not a distant reality waiting to arrive. It is a mirror reflecting what you do today. Every hour matters, every choice matters, every moment of discipline or weakness matters, because one day you will meet your future. And when you do, it will not ask what you wanted, it will reveal what you built. So the question is not, what will my future be? The real question is, what am I building today?